Good evening, everyone. Great to see you all. We're going to get started here momentarily. We're going to give people some time to get in the room. Thank you for joining us. Okay, before we get started, please join me in acknowledging and paying respect to the indigenous peoples who are the original inhabitants of the land we are on today. The Chickahominy, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Mattaponi, Monacan, Nansman, Nottoway, Pamunkey, Potomac, Upper Mattaponi, and Rappahannock tribes, and pay our respect to their tribal members past and present. I'm Dr. Jawan Johnson. I would like to welcome you to this third installment of our Summer Sankofa series, a trilogy of genealogy workshops hosted by the Lemon Project. And we want to welcome you to this session, Oral History for the Family Historian. Throughout this conversation tonight, you have the opportunity to submit questions. Please use the chat feature for that. Also, we have some experienced genealogists here, so if you'd like to join the conversation and you want to enter in resources in the chat room that you may find helpful to other fellow genealogists here, feel free to do that. Tonight, we have a spectacular presenter, Mr. Andre Taylor. He's an oral historian at William & Mary Libraries. He collects oral histories from individuals associated with the school ranging from alumni to descendants of enslaved, as he will be also collecting oral histories as a part of the Lemon Project. Mr. Taylor spent 15 years as a print journalist, most recently at the Greensboro, North Carolina News and Record. As a journalist, he directed oral history projects, one in particular focused on the Tuskegee Airmen. While completing his master's degree at North Carolina State University, his research focused on the impacts of climate change and sea level rise on the cultural heritage of the Gullah Geechee community in St. Helena Island, South Carolina. Without further ado, I would like to welcome my friend, Mr. Andre Taylor, who is presenting to us tonight. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening, everybody. I hope all is well. As Dr. Johnson said, I'm Andre Taylor. I've been in William & Mary for about a year now, just over a year, and have had a lot of fun collecting oral histories and actually training people in oral histories in the community. One of the highlights of my days is when I get to sit in front of a group of people and teach them how to conduct oral histories within their families. Too often, we let loved ones go to the other side before we get a chance to collect their stories. I myself am guilty of that, and actually it's one of the reasons that I dove into doing oral histories. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to go to a presentation that I've put together for you all. So let me bring that up for you. All right. So preserving your family legacy through oral history is something that I find to be very interesting, very fulfilling, very fun. And it's just a great way of being able to tell your family's history. What is an oral history and why are they important? We've all heard various stories from loved ones that are a little older, and we may think that, you know, their recollection of shaking hands with Dr. Martin Luther King one day over chicken dinner in Baltimore may sound intriguing and like they're, you know, lying about something. But for the most part, some of these stories could be true. What we read in history books, you know, sometimes we have family members that were at some of these events, and even for non-historical events within the family, you have people who can give you a story about who made the best fried chicken, what was in this recipe, you know, who who introduced who in the family, how did this person get married? So all of these stories add to the narratives within our family. And they're very important because, again, things that are written, and we don't have any other vantage points to hear from other people. And that's why oral histories are very important, because they give life to narratives. Some narratives are already exhilarating enough, but you never know that one other story could be the one that really propels things forward. So make sure that when you consider, if you want to do an oral history of your family, consider the people who would give you those stories that would make things lively and give you the full narrative. So conducting an oral history can be an amazing experience. Sometimes we learn things about people we had no idea about. It's very important to sit back with those individuals and just dive into those stories that they're telling. You can hear stories about migrations of families, educations of families, and so on. You never know what you're going to get in an oral history. They can be very short sometimes, with people who are just not willing to really talk a lot. You get those, that happens. And then you get people who want to talk to you so much that they say, hey, can you come back tomorrow so I can tell you the rest of the story? Those are the ones that you really, really love, because they're so full of information. They're exhilarating. You walk away feeling fulfilled. And within your families, a lot of families, what you do get a lot of sometimes is, but we don't talk about that, or that's not something we want to hear about. But that when you get people who do talk, it makes it that much better, and it adds to the pleasure of doing this work. So doing these interviews, it's a lot of pre-planning that goes into doing oral histories. I know that we're talking about doing oral histories with family, and you may think that you just shouldn't do too much planning, but even with family, there's a lot of things that you should look into. So I have these bullet points that I go by when I'm doing oral histories. I narrowed it down to these 5 points because these are 5 points that speak to work and make things a little bit easier when you do your planning. Researching your topic is the first thing you want to do. You don't want to go to Big Mama or however you address her and say, hey, how was it growing up in Philadelphia? Grandmama's from Valdosta, Georgia. She never touched Philadelphia until she was a grown woman. So you want to make sure you have your facts straight, even with your family, because this is work that will one day be shared with other family members. You want to make sure that your information is correct. And while you're researching your topic within your family, well, when you're researching your family, pick the right people who can give the right recollection to things, because those are going to be the people who are going to give you the best information. They're going to serve as the best narrators, which is the next point, selecting your narrator. This is where your project is going to it's going to fly or it's going to flop. It's as simple as that. You don't want to have somebody who you say, so tell me, when did the family migrate from Mississippi to Chicago? And they say, I don't know. It was in the 1920s. Well, what year in the 1920s? I don't know, one of them. You want somebody that's going to be able to say, it was 1923 where we first found that we had some jobs waiting for us in Chicago. We could get from Mississippi to Chicago. So the family moved there. We settled in this neighborhood, and this is why. You want somebody that's going to give you that information. Not that the person who doesn't have that much information to give and doesn't have a stronger recollection, their voices matter as well. However, you do want to make sure that you have someone who is ready to give you the information needed to really add to your family's legacy in this oral history project. Drafting questions. Know this much: you should draft enough questions to get your interview going, knowing that there are going to be follow-up questions that come from them. Questions as simple as, why did you leave the South to go to the North? Well, there were jobs there. So what kind of jobs? Where were you working? What kind of a facility was it? Where did you live? Those are going to be spin-off questions that will help bolster your interview. And sometimes you'll be surprised at what you get from those questions. I know for some of the work that I've done at William and Mary and other places, you ask a question of, where did you guys eat? And next thing you know, there's this hour-long dialogue about food waste. And we'll talk about that later on, the correlation that I feel exists between oral histories and foodways. But you come up with follow-up questions all the way through, and pay attention to the people as they're talking. What's going to happen is they'll give you a nugget and they want you to ask another question about it. So that goes to the next point of be an ear. You know, the narrator, who is the storyteller, this is their story. This is their moment. This is their moment to share their story. This is not about you. This isn't your moment to say, you know, I feel the same exact way. Oh yeah, I remember those hot. It is not about you. This is about that individual, and you're talking to them because you want this story, because this story means something to your family. This story means something to your community. This story means something to that person. So you have to take it as such and understand that with the information that's being given to you, these are jewels, and these are jewels that should be protected and preserved. Last step, think of your next steps. You've conducted this interview, you've got 4 interviews, 5 interviews, however you want to consider it. You have a family reunion coming up. You know, do you want to have these play throughout, which could be long, it could be boring, or do you want to take it and condense them into something that's more tangible? You want to have a mini documentary that you can share with people at a family reunion, or if somebody's having a birthday party, and especially during COVID, you could produce something with oral histories that you gathered from the family and combine them with pictures and other videos. Actually, you know, if you have some digitized family videos that you can help bolster a documentary with, these are things that I think of when I think of doing oral histories. Like, it's not just a one process type deal. It's not just, you know, one dimensional in that I've conducted this oral history, now it's just going to sit here forever. No, you need to think about how you're going to share this with the world, because when you sit down and do oral histories, yeah, this is that individual story, but what was your purpose for collecting this information? Are you going to have it where it just sits, or do you want the world to see how dynamic this person really is? So think of your next steps in the process of planning to do your oral history projects, because it's going to be important to how you deliver this information later. Missed opportunities. We all have that shoulda, coulda, woulda moment, be it with, you know, I should have paid this bill early. You know, I should have gone here. I should have traveled here before COVID. Now it's shut down. You know, we all have those moments where we have these missed opportunities. And with oral histories, too often they come fast and furious. I've had situations with oral histories recently. I was supposed to do one and got a phone call from the woman. I saw her number pop up and I said, hey, I'm looking forward to meeting with you next week. Well, it was her son. She had died. So that was a missed opportunity, you know, and I sat here thinking, I should have done that interview earlier. I should have met with her last week instead of going to a luncheon with some coworkers. I should have done this. I should have done that. And it's a missed opportunity. But missed opportunities sometimes can render a positive outcome. This gentleman here is probably one of the folks that sits on my shoulder frequently when I consider doing oral histories. This is my grandfather. My grandfather told many war stories. He told stories of how he had this gun and he held this many POWs and he was this, he was that. And as a 14-year-old, it all sounded like, okay, grandpa's had a drink today. Must be nice. Okay, grandpa, right. And he died November 30th, 1993. And I find myself putting together his stories by doing genealogy work, finding where he lived, where he grew up. He had always told me that I grew up in Red Springs, North Carolina. Well, we found his draft card and see that he's from Shannon, North Carolina, which it backs up to Red Springs, North Carolina. But you start to develop these ideas of the stories. You try to rebuild them, and you have to go back through archives. You have to find different things to talk about this person and try to relive this, remember the stories. It can be difficult, and that's why I call this my biggest missed opportunity, because there I was frequently sitting with him and could have easily recorded these conversations. I could have written them down, and I did not. So a part of that family is gone now. And with him went one of the family recipes for biscuits. That's one of those things that we just won't have anymore because it went to the grave with him because nobody wrote it down. We've all had those moments in the holidays where we're making a meal and we're learning, we're listening, we're feeling this moment of nostalgia because we smell the sweet potatoes, we smell the collard greens, the mac and cheese is baking, the OJs are playing in the background. It is close to Christmas time. We have these moments, and yet we always use them as a missed opportunity. And I say that in that foodways are probably one of the best ways, in my opinion, in collecting oral histories, especially when we're looking at the African-American community. Too often do recipes reside in the motto of a pinch of this, a pinch of that. Nothing is written down. They are passed down by the true oral traditions of Africa. So you have this griot in front of you that's your grandmother or your grandfather. And what you have is this moment where you can be asking them questions. Tell me about this family member. Tell me about that family member. Why do we make this every year? Where did this come from? There was an oral history that I did with a family in North Carolina, and we were able to trace her descendants, well, his descendants back to a plantation, and realize that the one person who they had a full name for in this plantation, it was his great grandmother. She was the cook. She cooked for this family at the Mordecai Plantation in Raleigh, North Carolina. And within that, there are recipes that she created that were never written down, but were passed down orally. And this oral tradition of passing these things down, it's much richer than just the recipe. What we have here, when we think of generational wealth, we think of finance, but you have this generational wealth of knowledge that can be passed down within your family, and we don't take advantage of those moments. So understanding that foodways and family, the correlation with those in oral histories, they're synonymous because with the recipes that are prepared, you know, somebody went to the field to pick these. Well, why did they pick those in the field? Well, we've always picked those. When our family on plantations, we were responsible for picking this. These are ways of diving into your family's history that often we don't think about. Family gatherings are definitely a point where we should all focus on who we can learn from. Yeah, it's fun to sit there and eat and talk and laugh and joke, but at the same time, consider sitting down and doing oral histories, because, excuse me, there are going to be generations later on that are going to want to sit back and hear these stories. This here is Wilma Jean McLean. This is my grandmother, and these are my two daughters, Adeline and Ashlyn. Family moments like this, where you have this, again, it goes back to generational wealth and not talking about finance, we're talking about history. I have my grandmother and her great granddaughters. Why not have this as an opportunity to talk to her about what was it like giving birth to my mother? What was it like for her growing up? Why did you move to Philadelphia? These are the moments that we should be documenting within our family. And it's very important that we do this, because at some point, these young people, these younger generations are going to want to know eventually, well, who was this person? Why do they exist? Why don't we hear much about them? Tell me more about them. So collecting oral histories is just that way of providing that. You have this opportunity to take information, put it together. You can have a slideshow. It could just be a voice recording. And we'll talk in a minute about ways of conducting oral histories. But you can easily go the route of just taking a recorder. All of us have smartphones now for the most part. You can use that to record it. You can use that to record the video or the audio. But take time in these moments to utilize the technology that we have readily available to collect these stories, preserve these stories, use these stories to tell your family's legacy. So with that, I'm going to open it to questions, and we will be able to have a good dialogue about why oral histories are important and why we should be collecting them as often as we can. You're muted, Juwan.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I do have one question about, do you have any suggestions on recording devices for audio? You just told us, of course, the smartphone, but aside from your phone, what other recording devices would you recommend?
So I've used audio recorders, Zoom, not this Zoom, but there's a Zoom recorder that works well. It's very easy to use. And the best part about it is it's not a tape, but it has a small SD card that you insert into it that once you're done, you can put it into the side of your computer, download the information into your computer and go from there. What I found is using a recorder can be great, but then it's just like, if it's just a voice, well, what are we going to add to this voice to bolster it? How are we going to extend this? How are we going to use this as something tangible? So that's when you get pictures. The pictures that I showed, these are pictures that you take and you take it and use it as a voiceover. You have these images coming and going, and you have this person's voice. So now you see this person either as they were before, as they are now, or however you may want to go. But it adds an element of intrigue because you have these images and you have this voice, but you don't see the pictures talking, but you know that the voice you hear belongs to the person in the screen. And I've always found found slideshows to be very impactful, very helpful, almost sometimes more so than a video.
There was another question on ways to present, and maybe you'll touch on this later, to your ways to share the oral history with family members.
Yeah, so a lot of family members, like I said, sometimes they want to have a reunion, they want to have a birthday party, they want to have something, and the person who is being celebrated, often we don't have time, we don't have their voices. I'm thinking in terms of probably funerals and such, when you have a celebration of life. And so what you want is you want to be able to have access to these oral histories. You want to have access to the voices, have access to the images, and be able to create things that people can sit and watch, things you can share. Documentaries are one way. They can be difficult to do. They can be tedious. They can be a total nut job. It can make you go crazy trying to pull together a documentary, but they're important to have because we live in a digital world where everybody's on the go. Nobody is really sitting down long. People are in transit. People are moving constantly. So what do? We give them a phone. We let them watch things on the way. You're on your plane, you're on your train, you're on the bus, whatever you're on. Just don't watch it while you're driving your car. But we have those moments where you can pull together things and share them with people instantly. Social media gives you a platform as well to share. So you can either send these things to individuals through email, through text message, or you can even have it where it's on a social media platform, but people have access to watch. People have time to learn more about their family. They get to see the person. So those are techniques and platforms that I often consider when doing oral history work and thinking about the next steps after you do the project.
There's also a question about transcribing a recording. And I know there are some apps, that have that feature, the voice recording apps that I've used and have been pretty good. Do you have any recommendations in terms of maybe a recorder an app or something that actually would transcribe?
Honestly, what I've found, one of the better transcription devices that I've seen has actually been Zoom. It may once you do a recorded session in Zoom, it generates transcription for you. And I've gone through, and it's about maybe 92% correct. You may have to change a couple names. I believe one of them, the lady name was Shell, and it said selling. And I'm like, no, it's not that at all. So you go and you make those minor alterations and edits along the way. But if you have the time to do it, nothing beats press and record several times to get the transcription and do it yourself. Is it tedious? Yes. Would I recommend it to anybody? Not on my life, but it will give you that opportunity to go back and forth. And to me, it's nothing like going back and hearing the voice of a loved one over and over and over again, especially if they're not here. Because what that does is that sparks something within you that says, wow, I remember this story now. I remember that. And as you're writing it, as we know, when you write something in repetition, I think we've all been in trouble before in elementary school. I will not put gum in my book. It becomes entrenched in your mind. So now you're writing this over and over again, and now you're reliving the story. The story is embedded in you. This is now something that is a part of you. And there's some times where you go and you want these stories, you desire them, you lust for these stories, and you forget them. With old age, some things just don't stick around as much. But once you begin to listen to them often, you're writing it during the transcription. That's the one reason why I would suggest transcription, because now you don't forget these things. It's now stored in your memory. But there are apps out there. Like I said, Zoom is probably the best one. Then there's different companies that if you wanted to send some, I believe that you can get an oral history transcribed for about $50 with some of the things that some of the companies that they have online. You can just type in oral history transcription or story transcription, and these companies will pop up for you.
I was also going to say, when you transcribe it yourself, that also you may have other questions that arrive during that time of spending really a lot of time with the interview. And there are certain things that you knew that were taking place in that setting that the person who may be transcribing it for you may not, be apprised of. So, with that said, there's another question about the specific skills, and you touched on some, and techniques to create a high quality oral history interview.
Patience is always going to be number one. Depending on who you're talking to, some people may jump from place to place. I have sat with interviews where the person said, I remember growing up on a farm and right outside Fayetteville, North Carolina in the 1920s, and it was a great time. I'm like, okay, well, explain the great time. Well, in 1992, and it's just like, well, wait a minute, how do we get from this period to that period? So it takes patience to bring people back in, and often, sometimes, you wear thin. You don't want to go back down that rabbit hole, but patience is the best thing, and being prepared. The worst thing you can do is go into an interview and not be prepared. And when I mean by not being prepared, it's just having your facts wrong. I mean, we get things wrong. The purpose of an oral history is to get things right, but go into it with the right set of questions. You don't want to ask the question about somebody being in World War II and they were born after Vietnam. So, wrong war, wrong time period. So make sure you have those things impact have those things ready to go. And I would say this too, we all are oral historians. We just don't realize that we are. All of us have sat down with a grandparent, with an aunt, with an uncle, with a sibling, with the cake lady down the street, the church lady who makes the cakes. We've all sat down with these individuals and had these conversations with them. We may not have written them down, but the questions that we asked, hey, why did you start making cakes? Why did you go to that church? Who taught you these things? We've all been oral historians before, so it's all within us. This is nothing new to us. This is actually who we are. By nature, humans are very inquisitive beings. And by asking certain questions, it's just like, wow, I didn't realize that I was doing the work of the oral historian, but you have been.
In terms of that, how do you, when you have these, moments of silence, some would call it awkward silence. I don't think it's awkward, but how do you allow that to work for you in the interviewing process?
Actually, it's twofold.
Mhm.
One, it gives that person time to think about what they're trying to say, because usually when it's that silence, there's a couple things that are happening. One, they literally just forgot what was going on. Two, they want to say something the right way. And there's no right or wrong way when conducting oral history to say something. I mean, it's your story. You own this. This is you. Um, but for the person, the interviewer, what it does is it gives you that moment to come up with more questions. So I wouldn't call it dead silence as much as I call it the intermission. It's an intermission. It gives you an opportunity to push this forward. Now, there are some people who you have to pull, you have to drag, you have to put them in a car to get them where you want them to go. But those moments of silence help you, honestly, because now you see if a person's nervous, you see if a person is really just trying to think, and it helps you pivot and say, okay, this person's nervous. Then that's when you go for this question. So tell me about one of your favorite meals that you had that your grandma made. We all have that story. We all remember, the sounds of that chicken frying, and you knew that it was just 10 more minutes left and you get to bite it fresh out the grease. We all have those moments. And what you do is within that awkwardness, you change it and now it becomes a positive moment where now everybody wants to be in, everybody wants to talk, everybody wants to remember. And once you get them talking there, then you can start asking other questions, because that question alone is going to render other follow-up questions.
In terms of there's a question here regarding what is a good icebreaker. I often refer to it as building rapport. How do you go about that? Because that takes place, that's happening during the interview, but also well before that interview.
Uh, it depends on the person. I mean, when they walk in the room, you're going to feel that energy. There's one individual, I'm not going to give his name, but he came into swim library. We went into the studio and he had about as much hair as I have on the palm of my hand. And he broke out a comb and started combing his scalp. And I said, don't hurt nobody now. And it was just one of those moments where we got to laugh. And he said, listen, I've been combing my hair. And I said, you're what? And he said, I've been combing this hair of mine since as far as I can remember. And we laughed and we talked. And he said, I got about a half hour to talk to you today. And I said, all right, we're gonna make this the best half hour. 2 hours later, we were still in the middle of this interview. And it was just, it was a hoot, but other people are more reserved. So you have to ask them a question. Hey, how was your ride over here? Hey, did you find a parking right? Because I have problems parking out here at this library. And sometimes it's things that are just as simple as that to get a person going. I definitely steer clear when it comes to sports, because some people take sports too seriously. You might say, oh man, Cowboys are going to stink it up this year. Next thing you know, the person's walking out the room. But you stick to things that are in front of you. Food. I know I talk a lot about food, but asking questions about food or saying that, man, I sure am hungry. Those are things that definitely could get somebody talking. And another thing that I love doing in oral history interviews, I'll have a couple types of bottles of water. I'll have a cold bottle, I'll have a room temperature bottle, and I'll have a warm bottle, because you never know what people want to drink. And giving them those options actually opens up this door because they feel appreciated. And another thing, this goes back to research, being able to find diversity in the people you're talking to, and being able to associate them with a simple hello. Saying, if you're talking to a person who speaks Mandarin, you may have it where you say hello to them in their native language. This makes a person feel appreciated. The one thing we all want in the world, most people, some people want to be rich, some people want to be comfortable. We all want to be appreciated. We all want to be respected. And showing that you have this respect for a person's language and for their cultural heritage, that is a big way of breaking the ice, because then the next question is when they start speaking back to you in a language, you go, okay, I go as far as hello, and then you laugh about it, and what they realize is you tried to meet them. And again, it goes back to my statement that we all want to be appreciated.
In terms of the construction of the outline or the flow of questions, there's a question regarding that. Of course, pre-interview process, you mentioned research, but also when you're constructing that outline of those questions, what process do you follow?
So I'll take a historical situation. Here in Williamsburg, you have First Baptist Church, and a lot of people, a lot of the older generation still talk about the day Martin Luther King came to First Baptist. So with that, I'll look for articles. I'll look for church announcements. And before I do these oral histories, I want to see a list of the officers that are within the church. If I can find something that lists the officers that were there that day. And what you do is you look at Martin Luther King's legacy, and we can pull from that. But then you take it and you localize it. Why was he in Williamsburg? Why did he go to First Baptist Church? Did he speak? What did he speak about? And then you start to develop your questions, and then you individually develop your questions by people who would have been close. The pastor, why did the pastor feel like he should have acknowledged Martin Luther King Jr.? Because he wasn't there to speak. He was there visiting the church. He wasn't in the pulpit. And it's one of those things where it's Martin Luther King Jr., so yeah, you acknowledge him, but how do you acknowledge him? Do you do it to a group? Do you do it before the whole church? How do you do it? And the individuals who were responsible for opening doors for Dr. King, people who would have been in his detail to get him to and from places, you ask them questions. What was he like? How much taller than you were he? How much taller was he than you? What did he say to you? Did he have a handkerchief when you sneezed? You ask these types of questions, and you develop questions based upon the person who's the historical figure that's in this. And then you develop questions for the narrator to understand the juxtaposition between them and this historical figure that was there. So it becomes a working research paper almost, and you're asking the questions that you want answered in oral form as opposed to written form. And then those are always going to render follow-up questions, and when you're talking about certain historical figures, it's always going to have a follow-up question. Even within your family, if you're doing an interview with your grandparents or your parents or whoever the case may be, you want to make sure that you have some good questions. You may think the answers to them, but you might be surprised. One surprise that came up was, we interviewed I wanted to talk about your dad. Oh, that wasn't my dad. That was just my mom's boyfriend. It's like, oops, didn't know that. But that has happened. And it is the most awkward of awkward situations. How do you rebound from that? I sincerely apologize. I didn't do my research on that question. I didn't know that. Tell me more about that. And then you just flip it and then you go with it. But the best thing with questions is you can go in with a bunch of questions. I try to go in with probably 15 to 20 questions. I know that sounds like a very small amount, but I know that those 15 to 20 are going to give me probably 60 to 80, because everything is going to be a follow-up question. So even if you don't have a lot of questions, just know that the most pertinent of your questions will render you lots of follow-up questions to get the answers that you're looking for.
Thanks for that. This is another question, and it was kind of related to a follow-up question to you, because oftentimes when we're doing oral history interviews, it leads to sometimes the gifting of materials. Yes. And I'm quite sure you have several stories regarding that, but this is a question that states that what are the things, material, documents, artifacts that the current generation should save so that when they're elders and family, the history is preserved. Can you speak to that?
Yes, I can. Pictures, save pictures, save birth announcements. A lot of small, depending on where you are, a lot of small towns will still say, you know, this person got engaged to this person got married to this person had this baby on this day. You'll have those announcements. Church uh, church announcements and that they give out when you walk into the church, those often will have information that will tell about a person. You know, you can look at it, okay, this person was of the AME faith. You know, this is where they would go and worship. This is what they would do. Clothing, you know, there's, you know, grandma always wore this shawl. You know, this was her favorite thing, you know. You keep those things, you know. I know they may take up space, but there are ways to keep those in a minimum space, but you make sure you keep those personal effects. Books, certain types of books, like this book was given to me during an oral history with Charles McGee, who was a Tuskegee Airman. And it's just like I have the oral history and I'm talking to him about things that aren't in the book, but if I wanted another resource, I got the book. So you keep things like that. You store them in places where they're not going to be interrupted by pipes bursting, flooding, extreme heat. You want to make sure you keep those types of items and somewhere where it's nice and cool, somewhere where it's not moist. And there's ways of actually preserving them, you know, using acid-free boxes, acid-free folders to preserve those paper documents. And then there's types of cloth that you would wrap different types of metals and woods in. So, but definitely, and with this generation in particular, somebody actually offered me a cell phone during an oral history before. And I said, well, isn't this yours? Oh, this is my old one, but I got this one to replace that one. And I laughed about it until I thought, my goodness, this definitely speaks to this generation. This is something that we need to keep. So we kept it. You know, we took the cell phone and it actually helped tell a story in North Carolina at a museum I was at there. And it was just exhilarating, like, oh my gosh, a cell phone. Who would have thought? You know, because I come from a generation where we didn't have cell phones. You know, you had a quarter in your pocket for that payphone down the street, which you no longer see anymore. And that was it. So it's things like that. T-shirts, sneakers are things, you know, some people, when you're talking about younger people, you say, hey, you know, your dancing styles, what helps you with that? And it's just like, oh, well, you know, when I wear these shoes, bam, there it is. We're talking about the shoe. We're talking about how the shoe fits, why the shoe is important. Why do you pick that type of shoe? And the shoe now becomes a part of the narrative. So if you collect the shoe begins to tell that part of the story.
In terms of digitizing photos, materials, and whatnot, what are some of the methods you would recommend for that?
I would recommend using for one, I would recommend using a color printer as opposed to like your regular black and white. If you're doing, let's say you're doing something just like a regular document, a black and white document, that's fine to digitize it that way. But what you want to do is make sure that you use color printers, color scanners, be it at a store or a library. A lot of libraries will have access to these types of printing devices to help you out. So I would definitely say avoid regular Xerox if you can, because you're not going to get the full effect. You know, you stand a chance of having the tone be too dark on something. So using the color is probably the best way to go. Check your local library, check university libraries. University libraries are often willing to help you if you call to say, hey, I have this, I need some help with that. And they more than likely, they'll make themselves available to you to use the facilities that they have so that you can get the proper digitization of whatever it is you're trying to digitize. And often universities, if you get the right person on the phone, sometimes they will help you for free. And you may come out cheaper, even if they only charge you 15 to 25 cents per page or whatever you're trying to copy. You may come out cheaper than you would go into like a FedEx office or something like that, or Office Max or something. So you may come out cheaper going to your local library. So check there first.
Another question I was going to ask pertains to kind of my own experience in terms of interviewing within my culture. And and interviewing within groups, because you have someone like my late grandmother who was not going to talk alone, but she was talking to group. So what's your recommendations for facilitating these kind of group setting type of interviews?
I love doing individual interviews first, because sometimes I want to get the organic story from you. I want your version of this. And I've had interviews before, and when I did groups, and it's just like, hey, don't you remember this? Oh yeah, I do remember that. And you don't. You're pacifying the person who's asking the question. And I've done interviews before where I did the single version, and you talk to one person and they give you this great interview, and then after that, they join the group and it's the same story. It's organic. It is what it was. Nobody is pulling something out of anybody. Nobody's prompting you to do something. They're actually just listening, and regurgitating what's in their mind. So I like that approach better. But group dynamics, I would often say this too. Sometimes people don't want to admit when a loved one has lost their memory. They don't want to openly say, my grandmother has dementia, my uncle is suffering with Alzheimer's. They don't want to make those acknowledgments. So what they do is they just put them in front of people in a group setting, and they'll say things like, well, they can't really hear that well, but their mind is there. And you start asking questions loud enough for them to hear, and you realize that that's not the case. And I've had that experience as well. And it's okay to not put family who are going through these cognitive situations. It's okay not to put them in front of people, even if it's in a group setting, because eventually everybody now, their attention is protecting the person who's being put out there in front, and nobody's really giving you the story you're looking for. So make sure, it goes back to what I said early on about picking your narrators. Just because somebody is family does not mean that they will give you the actual piece that you're looking for. And with research, as you well know, we go in looking, and what we're looking for turns out to be something totally different. So you have to be ready for that on the fly. In situations where you do have a person who cognitively is not present, you have to find ways of keeping them engaged with like questions. Talk about your hair, your clothes. How much do you love your sister and why? It may sound like a boring, childish question, but for a person who may not remember everything, there are certain things that stick to the heart. And when the heart speaks, you really should listen. So again, I try not to purposely do groups first. I love to do the individual interviews first. And then if there's an opportunity to do the group, then I go into that direction.
So any other final thoughts you would like to share with us?
Oral histories are amazing. Oral histories are fun. And as I stated earlier, we've all done the work of the oral historian. We've all asked the questions. We've all dug into our family history, our local history, history of the institutions we work in or attend school or church. We've asked questions. Don't be afraid in this work. It can be difficult, especially when you're closely associated with a topic or an individual. It can be very difficult because your feelings are heavily involved, but we have to step back. You have to take a breath, regroup, move forward, do the work. This is very critical work. None of us know our time. None of us know when that last moment's going to come for ourselves, for our loved ones, for people in our communities. So we have to do the work now while we still have this ability to, because without collecting these stories, history is boring. You read something in a book and it's just like, okay, great. This is in a book. This is one person's perspective. But when you have a person who can say, oh yeah, I remember when he came here and here's a picture of me talking to him, and it changes everything. History comes alive. And when history comes alive, you realize just how important history is. We know history is important, but once you hear the individuals who are not in the books give recollection to stories and have proof of it, it means something. It changes your life. It changes your world. It changes history. So I think that all of you who are on here, take pride in doing oral histories. It's fun. It's rewarding. Most importantly, it's critical.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Applauses. Of course, you see the thank yous in the chat. And thank you to everyone who participated in this series this summer, the Sankofa Genealogy Workshop Series. We definitely have some plans for the fall, and we will make those announcements soon. And so again, thank you all for participating in our project. Thank you for your support of our programs, and we hope that you all have a wonderful evening.